Hello, I'm Margaret Ryan, and I'm speaking here today with Michael Brune, who's the Executive Director of the Sierra Club. Michael, welcome to Clean Skies News.
Thanks, Margaret. Good to see you.
With the Gulf spill, we're hearing so much about the nation's oil addiction and talking about cutbacks, how we can cut back. We're using 19 million barrels a day. Back in 1974, when we first had a president say we had to get off foreign oil, it was only 12 million barrels a day that we were using. How did we get into this situation anyway?
Well, mostly just because we haven't had any concentrated, aggressive program to reduce our dependence on oil. Besides what was done in the mid-70s, primarily under President Jimmy Carter, when we phased out a lot of oil that was used to produce electricity, all that we've done is actually increase our dependence on one of the most carbon-intensive and socially and environmentally destructive fuels on the planet. And so we're in a very difficult position right now because we haven't invested in alternatives.
Now, non-transport uses, that's about a third of the oil we use as for home heating oil and feedstocks for fertilizer, plastics, so many other uses, industrial uses. Do you see a lot of possibilities for cutbacks on the non-transportation side?
There's a little bit of it. So again, you gave the figure 19 million barrels a day. It's fluctuated between 19 and 21. So I typically think of 20 million barrels a day, give or take, in a given year. How much oil we're consuming. And as you say, about a little less than a third is used for industrial purposes. Some of that is we could phase out fairly quickly. So for example, just to give a sense of the scale, we still use a tiny amount to produce electricity. We use a significantly larger amount for home heating oil. Both of those uses, if we were to phase out both sources of oil consumption there, that would eliminate about 25% of all the oil we get from the entire Gulf of Mexico. So we could eliminate the risk of blowout disasters like what we're seeing right now by instituting policy shifts that would make a big difference. Then when we start to think about plastics and pesticides and paints and fertilizers and cosmetics, for each major industrial source of oil consumption, there generally are good alternatives. Some of them are more difficult economically or more difficult politically to push through, but we do have good solutions.
Then the big area, though, about 70% of our oil use, according to EIA, is in transportation of one sort or another. What about there? How do we tackle that?
Okay, so look at it. You have to separate out moving people from moving freight. Cars, trucks, our cars, light trucks and SUVs, personal transportation counts for the majority of our oil consumption within transportation. And then moving stuff around with commercial, medium and heavy duty vehicles accounts for about 3 million barrels per day. So for the personal traffic, you and me getting from home to work, to the grocery store, to the gym, to the local Sierra Club chapter meeting, a lot of us use cars, right? And there's two solutions. One is to find ways to drive less. Individual actions are important. They're not sufficient. We won't solve the problem by everybody just riding their bike to the Home Depot store, right? But we actually can make a bit of a difference by driving less, carpooling, telecommuting when we can, taking mass transit. We do need to make a reduction in the overall amount of miles that we're traveling. The bigger thing, the single most effective thing that we can do to reduce our dependence on oil is to electrify transportation, promoting hybrid vehicles. Even better would be plug-in hybrid vehicles, and the best, of course, is electric vehicles, and then cleaning the grid to make sure that our electricity production is increasingly less carbon intensive as months and years go by.
Do you see a role for, there's several alternatives available now. There's some natural gas-fired vehicles, there are biofuels, there's talk at least about hydrogen. I mean, I know there's debate on how ready that technology is. Are any of those poised to make a big difference here?
Potentially somewhat for some uses. For the personal transportation, for the cars and trucks and SUVs that we might drive, I don't really see any of those playing a very big or useful role. Natural gas, the infrastructure requirements would be too significant. Biofuels, hydrogen is at least a decade away. Biofuels can contribute to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions if we're causing deforestation to produce palm oil and then shipping it over to the US, or corn-based ethanol. But when we start to look at heavy-duty vehicles, the big rigs that we see on the road that get 7, 8 miles per gallon, then we can start to think about what alternatives might work. Because you can't have an electric rig that's going from Omaha to Orlando.
18-wheeler doesn't do that.
No, not yet.
Electric.
Not yet.
Not
You know,
yet.
maybe someday. Maybe someday we'd see that. So that's where we start to see where maybe the next generation biofuels using algae that doesn't cause deforestation or doesn't cause major water use. Maybe some natural gas, if we can find a way to produce it without causing more ecological damage, could be useful. There's a lot of alternatives there that might work.
How about raising the price of gasoline? That's the one thing that has made people move off gasoline, but that's politically awfully tricky.
Yeah, awfully tricky, but not impossible. We would support an increase in the price of gasoline as long as it's not a regressive tax, as long as it's not hurting the people who can least afford it. So if there's some way to increase the cost of a fuel that is hurting America, that's harming our foreign policy, that is supporting terrorists, if we can find a way to get off oil by increasing the price of a substance that we need to phase out of and not penalize the people who have no alternative, then that would be something that the Sierra Club would support.
How would you go about that? I mean, how would you make it a progressive tax?
That's where it's tricky. So there might have to be some form of rebates or some system to compensate people who might not be able to buy a new plug-in hybrid car or a new electric car, but yet their job or where they live or their life circumstances are such that they can't take a bus very easily or they can't hop on a train or ride a bike. They need to drive, and they might not be able to switch to a cleaner vehicle. So finding some way to compensate those people who are trapped would be key to getting the Sierra Club support.
How long do you think a turnover of our current fleet of vehicles is going to take? I mean, the electric vehicles are just coming on the market. You say they're pretty expensive. They're not something everybody can afford, and they don't have the range yet that you really need for a total replacement.
Sure.
So what kind of timeline are you guys looking at?
Well, so if you look at how long the average vehicle is on the road, it's typically 15, 16, sometimes 17 years. And so getting completely off oil, going down to zero is awfully difficult to do. But making a big dent in breaking our oil addiction, that's something that's much more easily done. I shouldn't say it's much more easily done. It's achievable. It's aggressive, it's ambitious, it's hard to do, it's challenging, which are all the reasons why we should embrace this task. We can do it, but what it would take is a rapid phase-in of first plug-in hybrid vehicles and then electric vehicles, and then we would want to have some cash for guzzlers program to take some of the most inefficient vehicles off the road.
You've been here in Washington, you're talking to people who do make policy here.
Sure.
Do you see, are there any hope here? Do you think those policies can be put in place?
I think so. You know, we start to get stuck in quicksand when we talk about comprehensive climate legislation. But clearly this disaster in the Gulf has put into very stark relief the fact that we need to make better choices about our energy future in the U.S. You know, we can either stay stuck where we are, stuck where we've been for several decades, or we can move forward and we can create more prosperity in this country. We can cut the costs for drivers. We can improve the principles that surround our foreign policy, and that we're not financing countries that we don't trust, by making a significant investment in breaking our dependence on oil.
Now, Sierra Club has a campaign around July 4th, I believe, called Freedom from Oil. What are you asking people to do for that?
We're asking people to, on our website, a satellite website of the Sierra Club, which is letsmovebeyondoil.org. We're asking people to sign up to call on President Obama to make a pledge and make a plan to get America off oil in the next 20 years. Doesn't mean we'll get to zero in 20 years. It does mean that we can break the stranglehold that the oil industry has on our country. So we're asking people to sign up, and then just in advance of July 4th, here on the Mall, we'll be planting 10,000 American flags with returning veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, and the flags will spell out freedom from oil. So it's the launch of a campaign that we'll be doing for the next several years to do everything that we can to compel the leaders in our country to institute policies that actually make a difference. Okay,
well, Michael Brune, Executive Director of the Sierra Club, thanks so much for joining us today.
Sure, thanks for having me on.
I'm Margaret Ryan, Clean Skies News.